Welcome to the For the Love of Language podcast. I'm EJ.
And I am Stacy the Linguist. It's good to have you all here.
Yeah. And today we're going to cover kind of a basic, expansive topic about language families, like the expansiveness of language generally.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about here, but I think sometimes we forget like how many languages are actually out there because the majority of languages that are like spoken or popular are only about like 4% of the languages that are actually spoken worldwide. So maybe we can give a little perspective on what kinds of languages are out there and how they might be related to each other.
Yeah. So, I think to just start out with like the number of languages out there, a really good resource if you want to know about languages kind of broadly and dive into some details about any specific living language is Ethnologue.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go to ethnologue.com, they currently have 7,151 living languages documented, which is a lot.
It's a lot. It's a lot. It's not as much as there used to be because language death has become a lot more prominent in the 21st century. But we are working on making sure that number stays relatively where it's at.
That's actually interesting though, because I was looking at the Ethnologue site a little bit this morning, and they actually had some details about their latest edition, and they actually have more languages in this edition than in the last one.
Ooh.
Because yes, languages did die, unfortunately. There were a few languages that are no longer listed in the living languages. However, there were also languages that were discovered or languages that split off from other languages.
Mm-hmm.
And there were actually more of those that they documented than the ones that went extinct.
There you go. Oh, that's actually really lovely to hear. That's
Mhm.
always good news. Language death is probably the most depressing thing you can talk about in linguistics because not only does it involve the death of like a really cool language, but also like the death of a culture sometimes, which is really, really hard to talk about and, is really difficult for some of those communities who are particularly affected by language death, like indigenous communities. That's always really hard, but it's good to hear that there are more languages being documented and that are living. We love to see it. We love to see it.
Right? Yeah, it's fun. It's exciting. So yeah, the one unfortunate thing about Ethnologue is that it's gonna be it's not entirely free. So if you're at a university or something, then you might have access to it. Otherwise, you do have to pay to get full access. But it is one of the better resources as far as finding language information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Even us linguists in the professional realm, we use that. And those who do field work, we call it field work in linguistics. There are specific linguists who go out into the world and they bring their little microphones and their cameras and they have certain documenting techniques. They'll go out and they'll be working on documenting a lot of these languages that are listed and put that info in here so everybody can access that data and we can, do stuff with it and
Mm.
know about that language.
Right. And I say unfortunate, but like fundamentally, it's a great thing to support this kind of research. But yeah, you can still find some information on it though without
Hmm.
paying, but without the subscription, it is a little bit limited.
Yes.
Yeah, but let's talk a little bit. Like we just said, there's over 7,000 existing languages. And I think, if you spoke with most people, people could maybe list 10 or 20 off the top of their heads.
Hmm.
7,000 is a lot more than that.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And like the way the stats work out, about 96% of the world's of the world's languages are spoken by only 4% of the global population. So a lot of these languages, I mean, that those are some big numbers. Again, we're talking about people in like the thousands and millions, because there are billions of people on the planet currently. But still, there's like the majority of the languages that are spoken are kind of like those big name languages, like French and German and Russian and English. And some of those other 6,000 languages are relatively small and limited to certain groups.
Right. Yeah. And I think, if you're looking at the Americas, for example, most
Hmm.
people will think of, okay, you have English in the US, you have Spanish and Portuguese in Latin America,
Hmm.
English and French in Canada. But then there's actually a ton of other languages in the
Yeah.
Americas as well. You have all of the Native American languages. You have, other minority languages that have been brought over. Like
Hmm.
there's actually a lot of languages just in the Americas.
Yeah, even within like the US itself, not only do we have all of the indigenous languages that are still around, we also have, the US is notorious for immigration. So we have things like Korean and Chinese and Vietnamese, and Spanish and other like indigenous languages from Latin America, from like Mexico. Things like Quechua also exist in the US. Any of the other like small dialects that people bring with them, stuff like Swiss German is also something that has like been brought over and has actually kind of incorporated into certain dialects of English, which we can maybe talk about a different time. But there is a cacophony of language varieties even within the United States itself.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And we spoke a little bit in our previous episodes about like colonialization and how, prescriptivism and things can impact, language spread and whatnot. But let's dive a little bit more into kind of the, breadth of languages that we do have. And, especially maybe in places that English speakers are less familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
So, like in the US, we've mentioned we have Native American languages. You have the same type of thing in other places as well. So, like in Russia, obviously Russian is the main language. It's the language that's spoken in schools and whatnot. But you have a ton of tribal languages in
Mm-hmm.
Russia, especially in more northern Russia, that might
And
not even
Eastern
be.
Russia, yeah, towards Siberia.
Yeah, like you have the it's called Buryatsky in Russian. I think it's Buryat. Let me look this up real quick. I haven't really spoken about this language in English before. Which is a really weird thing to say, I guess. Yes, the Buryat language.
Way to really anglicize that pronunciation, EJ. A plus.
I'm having a hard time, I'm not gonna lie. So the reason I know about this specific language is that at one point I was a Mormon missionary in Russia, and one of they call it a mission companion, like you work always with another missionary as partners. And one of my companions was a Russian who was a member of the Buryat minority. And so she actually knew some Buryat, and is a very, very interesting to hear about because she did not actually value Buryat as a language,
Mhm.
in that, it wasn't useful to her. She felt like she couldn't move ahead in life speaking Buryat, and,
Yeah.
Russian was the only thing that was going to matter. And so, really interesting and also common scenario.
Very common, tragically common, unfortunately, for people in areas not only like Russia, but like all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
We talked a little bit about how English is becoming, a global language, and in many instances, people are kind of finding that like to get ahead in the world, you got to speak English or whatever the dominant language is, and so people might often not value or respect or even see their native language, the language that they use at home with their families and local communities, as something worthwhile, which is unfortunate because they really are.
Yeah. And like Buria is an interesting example because, she was in Russia, but it's actually a Mongolic language, which,
Hmm.
geographically makes sense with where, Russia is, but not at all related actually to the Russian language, which is Slavic, from the Slavic language family.
Yeah. I also think that in some areas of Russia, they also use Uyghur, and Uyghur is a very unique Turkic language. So Russia, as we all know, is just a massive beast on the globe. It's a very large country, and so it encompasses multiple language families, along with Russian and some of those languages. So you get a little bit of Turkic, a little bit of Mongolic, all kind of coming together in one country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, you could do the same thing here, talking about
Mhm.
pretty much any country in the world. I mean, you could go to
Yeah,
Australia and there's going to be a ton of languages there. You could go
yeah.
to, like, literally name a country and there's probably going to be way more languages there than you're expecting.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Speaking of Australia, Australia is notorious for having a plethora of languages, and a couple different language families. So, like the north of Australia and the south of Australia kind of differ in their language families, with the north being predominantly Pama-Nyungan languages, which is an indigenous language family that has like hundreds of different subgroups. So if you just say Pama-Nyungan, that's encompassing like a bunch of different indigenous languages in Australia, which a lot of people are working on preserving because that a lot of those languages were wiped out through colonialization. But yeah, in Australia alone, you have in definitely towards the thousands. In terms of individual languages within a couple of different language families.
Yeah. So maybe for some of our listeners who aren't as familiar with the construct of a language family, what is a language family?
Yeah. So a language family is a language that is usually imagine like a family tree, right? Usually there's some sort of similar like commonality. Maybe there's like some language that they branched off from. So they're related in certain ways. So probably the most notorious language family is the Romance language family. So the Romance language family has its roots in Latin primarily. And so these Latin was like a dominant language, and then these other languages branched off, and that's where we get Portuguese, Spanish, French, Romanian, and there's one other one that I always forget. But all of those are Latin-based languages. They're in the same family, so they'll often have commonalities. Maybe they'll share certain vocabulary words. Maybe they'll share similarities. They will often differ in pronunciation, but they might share other grammatical tendencies. Romance languages are notorious for having grammatical gender, for example. And you can kind of trace these things back to a similar language root. And so there are a bunch of different language families all over the place, these kinds of clusters of languages that are very similar in specific aspects because they have a similar like language root, but vary in other ways, enough for them to be called independent languages.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the question that naturally follows this is, okay, well, what is the root language of it all? And we don't know. We don't even know if
Right.
such a thing exists
Mm-hmm.
because there's also something called language isolates or linguistic orphans. So there are instances where we find a language that is completely unique, that doesn't seem to be related to other languages. And these are languages like Basque and certain languages in like Japan, for example. These languages that are kind of sometimes they're even surrounded by a more dominant language, but they themselves aren't related to that dominant language in any way. This often comes about because of geographic isolation, but they're still kind of a mystery to linguists. So language families, we can connect them here and there through historical precedents.
Mhm.
Maybe EJ, you can tell us a little bit about what like Proto-Indo-European what that language family is like. But yeah, so
Yeah.
we historically were able to kind of bring some of these things together, but it's a lot, and we still don't have a clear picture.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's actually a really, really good description of language families. And, I like how you pointed out, you have Romance languages, like that's a really good set. But then you can have, maybe you have the parent, you have the grandparent, you have the great great grandparent, and like language families, there's like multiple levels of.
Yeah.
And so the example of Proto-Indo-European is an interesting one because Proto-Indo-European is one of the most reconstructed ancestral languages
Yes.
that
It's like the great great grandfather of like Spanish and French and the like.
and also Germanic languages
Hmm.
and Slavic languages, I believe,
I
also
think
fall under.
Proto-Indo-European also touched in like Indian languages in like Hindi and Sanskrit, if my memory serves me.
Yeah, like Proto-Indo-European actually covers
Hmm.
a lot of the different languages. But like Stacey mentioned, it does not cover all of them. There's like plenty of languages that showed no relationship at all to Proto-Indo-European. But it's super, super interesting because there's in historical linguistics, there's been a lot of rules and patterns that have been found over time about how languages change, how they impact each other, how they diverge over time. And that's in like multiple facets of language. So you have that happening in morphology, which is word structure. You have that happening in phonology, which is, more of the sound structure of a language.
Hmm.
So in lots of different ways, we can reconstruct how languages change over time. And historical linguists have validated their theories by looking at existing languages and just using existing languages to reconstruct older languages that we still have enough text in and stuff to know how they were. And they validated that these patterns do work to accurately reconstruct older languages that we know about. And
Hmm.
so then they extrapolate farther from there in order to reconstruct farther and farther back in these
Hmm.
groups of languages. So super, super fascinating. There's like whole books that you can read about Proto-Indo-European. And there's a lot of, evidence that lead linguists to believe that there was this big ancestral language that further diverged into a ton of the different language families that we have. But again, not all of them. A lot of cultures have this myth of an Adamic language of
Hmm.
like God's language that was the original language that was the start of all others. And there's some beautiful mythology around that, but there's really no evidence to support it.
Yeah. And that's mostly because like humanity in terms of like evolution like really spread itself out and people developed independently of each other. So as great as it would be to say that all languages stem from one language, even if we look at just how people have spread across the world, we can see that like as migration happened, languages developed independently. So there might not necessarily be one like pure language out of Africa or something, even if you were to take a more, scientific evolutionary stance on it, because people have like developed in different ways in different places across the globe, you are going to see, for example, like Proto-Indo-European being one for the majority of the European and Asian continent, but that doesn't necessarily apply to like the Americas, which underwent a very different process and different like development because it's so separate from the peoples of the Asian and European continent. continent.
Mm.
So as beautiful as that would be to say, we can find the like one true language, it's highly unlikely just based on how people migrated and developed over time.
Right. And there's actually some evidence that would indicate to the contrary that there isn't, because there's clear examples of sign language is, for instance, just being created by communities
Mm-hmm.
independently. And so if we see people actively creating language, then like presumably that didn't just start happening now. Like clearly it's a possibility and something that does happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the example that EJ is mentioning is something that we've actually documented fairly recently in Nicaragua. So the Nicaraguan sign language is one of those instances where they brought a bunch of children to a deaf school, of course, deaf, hard of hearing children, to a school to try and teach them lip reading and basic vocalizations to try and get them to speak and read in Spanish. But it was very hard for these deaf children to do that because it takes a while. Anyone who knows anything about like deaf culture and lip reading, like it's a hard skill to learn. But they found that the children began communicating using a sign language amongst themselves. The children developed their own sign language, and this happened in like the 70s. And so we have like video footage and like firsthand accounts of exactly like what these children were doing to develop their own language. And from my recollection, it does have some elements of like Spanish in it, but they're kind of few and far between. These children really kind of developed the sign language themselves, and then as the older children grew up, the other younger children acquired it quicker and then passed it down to the other children coming to the school. So it was able to develop pretty rapidly in terms of language development, because it was just children passing it to other children who acquired it, got a grasp of it, gave it the grammar that it needed to succeed as a language, and then just keep passing it to other kids.
Which is super cool.
It's absolutely phenomenal. And so linguists have just like eaten this up, being like, oh my goodness, like language can kind of have sort of a spontaneity to it, and it comes out of like a source of necessity, and people can kind of build it almost out of nothing.
Mm.
Again, not entirely nothing. Like we said, there are some elements of Spanish in there because I think these children did have the ability to read to a certain extent. But yeah, the ability for languages to be developed with no like pure root is absolutely phenomenal.
Definitely. Is there anything else we should dive into on this topic of language families?
I mean, I don't know if it would be advantageous to rattle off just a few of the big language families out there, ones that you might come across. So, for example, I mentioned Pama-Nyungan languages in Australia. Another big language family that's not necessarily European is the Bantu language family, which covers like a good chunk of Africa. I would say it covers most of sub-Saharan Africa, not quite to South Africa, but that strip all the way over to like Ethiopia. The Bantu language family kind of like does a little rainbow through the middle of Africa. And so there are a lot of really rich Bantu languages out there. A couple of other like language families that you might come across in indigenous language family in North America is the Algonquian language family, which which usually is from like the north part of sort of like New York, Maine, the northeast of the United States, upward reaching into Canada. That one is pretty big and pretty broad and has a lot of really interesting linguistic phenomenon. It's very morphologically dense. And those are a couple of the big ones right off the top of my head that aren't like Romance languages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess we didn't actually even talk about English. English is a Germanic language.
Yeah.
So in Middle English, there was a lot of influence from French. And so we do have some, French is a romance language, and therefore, comes from more of those Latin roots. And so there is definitely some of that influence in English with a lot of loan words and root words and stuff like that coming from Romance languages.
Mm-hmm.
However, English is absolutely a Germanic language. And
Yes.
so you'll see that a lot of our words that people just like naturally use when you're not trying to sound particularly educated and wordy are more from that Germanic root.
Mm-hmm.
And also like the words structure and sentence structure and stuff harkens more back towards that Germanic side. And so, Germanic languages, obviously you have German, you also have Dutch, you
Mm-hmm.
have Old Norse,
Mm-hmm.
which split off into the Scandinavian languages, Icelandic, Swedish, Norwegian. There's a lot of Germanic languages that fall into that category.
Yeah, absolutely. Not to mention Celtic language families, which are very interesting. So you find that in Wales, Scotland, Ireland. What's interesting about French is French even has some Celtic influence. That's why it sounds a little bit different from the other Romance languages. Portuguese and Spanish are far more closely related than Spanish and French are, because there is some Celtic influence in French.
And then, I love these Slavic languages, which
Yep.
Russian falls into. You have a bunch of other Eastern European languages that fall under that category.
I forget, is Polish Balkan, or is it in its own language family?
I'm going to look it up real quick so that I don't lie to you. So Polish is a Slavic language. So I
Slavic
like
language.
to
I thought
use
so.
I like to use Wikipedia to look up some language stuff. Obviously there are some potential flaws with using Wikipedia, but
But for the most part, it's pretty accurate.
for the most part, it's pretty accurate. And if you have any questions, what you can always do is click on the sources,
Mm-hmm.
and everything in Wikipedia should have the sources there so you can see where the information is actually coming from and validate it yourself.
Yes.
Which is a cool thing. Definitely note that. But yes, Polish is Slavic, which if you follow the language families on Wikipedia, it's Polish, above that Lechitic, then West Slavic, Slavic, Balto-Slavic, then Indo-European. So you can see like the entire family line coming down there, which is cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are definitely lots of resources about this type of thing out there. This is something that historical linguists do. People who do field work in linguistics, they make sure, to kind of place, if they find a new language, to place it within a certain family and talk about how it's related. There's a lot of hobbyists out there, right? We've talked about people who are like hobby linguists, and this is the kind of thing that they look into, which is really great because they have a little bit of a boots on the ground kind of a perspective on these sorts of things. So there is an abundance of information through Ethnologue and through a bunch of free resources that talk about this. If you go under R linguistics on Reddit, you'll also find a lot of information and discussion about like language families and stuff like that. This is a hot topic for a lot of people.
Awesome. Well, should we call it there then?
Yes, let's do that.
All right.
Thank you all for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Follow us on Instagram at For the Love of Language. We'd love to hear from you. Till next time.
Bye.